Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. The strange music show that takes stars into the fringes of music, right? So in today's episode, we're finally looking at a solo album release from an artist we've discussed on this show before. This review actually also acts as an introduction to the strange cassette label Eustress Tapes, a cassette label who seem to print their album covers on tracing paper, giving them this unusual see-through effect. So this album, for me, works as a wonderful introduction to the solo work of Ross Scott Buchalek, who, when not curating content for his label Steak Gloss, is busy creating music under the moniker of Diurnal Burdens. I'm excited to discuss this one, as this is without one of my favourite albums from Diurnal Burdens, I have to say. So without further ado, I present On Trifling Hollowness by Diurnal Burdens. So, of course, who is Diurnal Burdens? Well, we did briefly answer this question before, but a brief rundown. Diurnal Burdens is the moniker for one Ross Scott Buchalek, whose surname I still can't say, I do apologise, owner and curator of the esoteric Steep Gloss. And so we're not releasing the most weirdest albums on his cassette label. Ross creates music under this moniker of Diurnal Burdens, an outlet that opts for some of the most unusual and strange sound designs, utilising a plethora of sources that result in some of the most enigmatic and unusual of lo-fi electronic ambient drone soundscapes. Very fascinating stuff that has seen releases, spanning an incredible number of different labels, as well as countless collaborations over the years. And so today we are reviewing On Trifling Hollowness, a 2-track cassette that offers some very grayscale, murky droning soundscapes that envelope you in these rather unsettling layers of fog and mist. So just briefly, what is On Trifling Hollowness? Well, this is a Diurnal Burden's contribution to the strange cassette label Eustress Tapes. Released back in 2024, this album comprises 2 very grayscale, monotoned soundscapes against this blurred vision of just swamps and bogs, a murky miasma of creeping subtle electronics. And I can't quite put my finger on why, but I find this to be a very engrossing little album experience, and a wonderful introduction to Eustress Tapes and also to the solo work of Diurnal Burden, so let's dive in. So opening up with Known for Ages, this one settles into the scene with an odd descent into these very boggy, murky lo-fi electronics. A gentle hum in a swamp as a strange sound occurrence just warbles and warps past in brief instances, looping and over in this strange enigmatic tapestry. And with this loop constantly occurring, it kind of sounds like a little bit like an alarm call of some kind, like maybe an animal sending out a warning signal in the dead of the nighttime as insects and creatures start to slowly creep in around or just around us. It becomes a very slow developing composition, one that feels very much built around this combination of strange electronic effects capturing instances of cassettes and loops, resulting in a very faint set of details hidden in amongst the fog and decay. At times, it feels like, like tangible shapes are briefly rearing their head, making themselves known, but then before you know it, the composition just navigates towards peculiar echoing haze, one that rattles in the very wind itself, travelling through the fields and trees. It's very peculiar, as the particulars of the music itself feel very completely alien, very unknowable, and yet listening to it, I kind of get this weird sense of being out in nature again, in the middle of the outdoors, much like we got when we listened to the collaborative album with Orina Totti, Esperluette. Much of that particular album had many sound occurrences that felt like the buzzing of outdoors, the hum of the sun, and the interference from the world existing all around us. And this one seems to navigate certain instances that feel very oddly reminiscent of that particular release, creating this odd sense of deja vu, like, have we been here before? But what was once sunny and glorious has now become very cold and derelict, a much darker instance of those familiar places. And I don't know for sure if it's something Buchalek is doing intentionally, like calling back to some of his other releases, or if I'm just reaching, but I thought the parallels were interesting nonetheless. In any case, the composition does end up navigating to more unusual sections. The bed of murky electronics just all seem to recede away and leave this very strange landscape that just where bubbles of sound just ping into the scene with a sense of randomness, perhaps, simmering over a gently lit flame and occurring against this steadily growing storm. It's as though we're suddenly pulled into a very different landscape, one that slowly transforms before our very eyes into this unusual deluge of looped noise. The occurrences sound so incredibly strange here, the very effects themselves suddenly caught in the echoed looping delay effects, and they just climb all over each other, bending into these very unusual frequencies. There is something strange about it, of course, but the navigation from the beginning of this point results in an experience that seems to just drag us along, hauling us alongside the growing levels of noise and interference. And I find myself just kind of marvelling in how oddly unsettling and uncomfortable it all is, but also how weirdly fascinating it is as well. Like, it just becomes, such a noisy deluge of samples and noise and instruments that become almost impossible to discern all the details of. It instead just seems to grow more and more abstract, fading out elements and letting new ones take the centre stage, be it the uncomfortable shuffling grind in your ears or the faint echoing effects that occur with those unusual frequencies. Very strange, but I find myself, just fascinated and enthralled just because it sounds the way it does here. And I don't know exactly how he does it all, but Ross seems to have this very peculiar approach when it comes to his music. Strange electronic occurrences mixing with the most indiscernible of field recordings, and it all just combines in a very weird way that just hypnotises you, despite being oddly harsh and uncomfortable in certain places. Like, I have to say, it's almost relentless in how it's just constantly just occurring all the time. Just more and more drones and electronics that just pour on top of each other. And I do get very hypnotised by the whole thing. Just very lulled and sucked into that strange grey scale world that the composition's offering. This backdrop of indiscernible grey shapes never forming into anything remotely tangible, it feels. And it all feels rather empty, I have to say. Just this echoing resonance of hollow, empty chambers, kind of calling back to the album's title on Trifling Hollowness. It's like it takes these strange sounds and just turns them into uncomfortable level feedback for the course of 20 minutes, creating this ever-circling dance of electronics that's just always occurring, never once letting you go though as it spirals down and down into the centre of the grey abyss. Very weird stuff, right? But let's flip over the cassette then, shall we? We get the next track of Empty All Along. And so after the slow minimal build-up of electronics into a wall of feedback and drone, what we have to close off this whole album, what do we have to close off this whole album then? Well, this track just kind of instantly starts, just this echoing delay of briefly intermittent sounds, the tiniest capture of a hidden message obscured in the growing fog. And from out of it, we get this slowly growing murmuration of lowercase, before it then occurs, we get this occurrence of an odd scene that feels like the sound of a plane flying overhead. That amazing effect that it produces when you just hear that plane just echoing and humming through the empty space, just resonating and vibrating in the very air itself. Like, it's very cool when it happens, and I feel like it's a very different scene from the previous track in many respects. But then again, there's many elements that feel oddly familiar, a sound palette that we may have come across before, or at least aspects of. And the composition becomes very strange though when it navigates towards these unusual little waves of sounds that loop over and over, almost caught in this unusual phaser effect as that plane just seems to get lower and lower, just descending further and further. I feel like it's almost like becoming unstuck in time and space, just finding yourself in this unusual grey landscape that just grows darker and darker with getting less discernible details with each and every second. And I think there's something very neat about it, of course. And they're very ominous in a lot of respects, but I like the atmosphere it all provides, creating a nice space for it all to just occur for many moments before once again receding into the background, just letting this strange metallic scratch just occur all of a sudden, like the scraping of guitar strings offset by the hollow, empty taps, before offering its own deluge of feedback and frequencies. It is so strange, especially when you get this very weird loop that feels almost like a jack-in-the-box type effect, just bouncing up and down. All the while you've got that deluge of electronics, frequencies and loops just occurring constantly against each other. It once again to me becomes that incomprehensible thing in noisy electronic music, but I find it so fascinating because it just seems to be creating this entire world of its own. to kind of go into it a little bit, these kinds of improvisations come across as simply creating sounds without really caring for the accessibility of it, but instead just the unusualness of the interactions these different sounds have with each other. As the loops fade in and out, you hear such a myriad mirage of electronics and sounds, all of which combine together in very unusual ways. Sometimes they sound very strange together. Other times they even almost clash, but regardless of it, they all contribute to the strange vibe as a result of them just sounding simply the way they do. Like with this one, it seems to devolve into these awkward slowed down recordings of human voices at times, set against a bed of electronic frequencies, at least it sounds like it. And it, for some reason, just creates this odd sense of like a laser just zapping it all into your brain, overloading your senses when you hear it, especially when the drones become more of a dominating factor. It becomes very unpredictable, like it's kind of keeping you always guessing what's going to be occurring next and what will we hear next. But there's also never a context for for the sounds, which makes it very interesting. And all I have to go on is purely how it all sounds, as well as how it's making me feel and what it makes me think when I experience it. For myself, I just find it so mesmerising. Just this growing storm of sounds, colliding against one another in a spectacular fashion. Especially as we get towards the middle half of this one, it just seems to get stranger and stranger. But arguably actually having a sense of musicality at times. Maybe just in context of this album though. A strange warbles of sounds and even stranger instances of brief recordings. Like, it's impossible to know the sources half the time, but whatever the hell Ross is utilising in the production of this particular release, it results in something I find oddly enigmatic and a little bit profound at times. A constantly evolving and shifting experimental dirge that navigates across a sea of almost nothingness. I am so oddly engrossed by it all. Every time I listen to this one. And I just always find myself very confused and weirded out, but very interested and entertained. Like, I'm just fascinated by the entire occurrence. And it just feels so wonderfully unpredictable, and I just find myself adoring those strange little warbles that constantly rear their head from time to time. It just sounds almost like a birdsong caught within effect, as the constantly occurring hum of interference electronics continues incessantly alongside it. Like, I don't know why, but I do think this is one of my favourite releases from Diurnal Burdens. I can't for a second even begin to explain what's actually going on here. But within my bewilderment and confusion, I just find myself delightfully lulled along the strange enigmatic journey this album offers. And I have heard a few Diurnal Burden releases before this one, a couple of solo ones and a couple of collaborative ones, but this one has quickly shot up to become one of my favourites. This very strange murmuring of hollow electronics. Very weird, but also cool. And I just find myself enthralled with this album ever since discovering it, It's really something I enjoy listening to, as I just seem to really vibe with the strange world that this album wants me to inhabit. But yeah, I do have to say, this is, as odd as it all is, I do think this is actually a lovely way to introduce the solo work of Diurnal Burden to the channel as well. Like, something that kind of follows on nicely from the previous albums we've looked at by Ross, Esperluette, the collaborative album with Orina Totti, but also Absence Blossom, the album under the moniker of Rhoda, the collaborative one, of course. Here, though, under his moniker of Diurnal Burdens and as a solo release, we see his approach to the world of improvised music just truly let loose, weaving together this incredibly strange tapestry that feels so uninviting, yet fascinating. And I don't know what it is about all these soundscapes, but I just truly seem to delight in how alien they always are. Like, I never know what to expect, but whenever I finish hearing it, it just seems to have made sense for some reason. And in the case of On Trifling Hollowness, maybe the answers to this one were in front of us all along. A dedication and tribute to the empty spaces of the world, maybe. So before we actually close off, I do have one final point I want to make before we get to the closing remarks. So, this is a bit of an odd story, but with nobody else to blame but literally myself. This album is now connected to the upcoming Burden Limbs release of our second album, It Hurts, coming out at some point in 2026. So the story goes, part of our development for the album resulted in the creation of a small 2-minute instrumental interlude track, a beautiful piano rendition of the melody from the album's third track, The Horrors to Come, played by band virtuoso Dr. Edmund Alexander Double-Heath. The classical sounding composition, as beautiful as it was, apparently needed some further context to tie it in together to the whole album experience. And as a result, I was tasked with both adding some emo drones to it, as well as creating some lowercase loops. So what I did in the recording studio was utilised my very ineffective and primitive rudimentary technique of simply grabbing cassettes, playing it through my cassette player into the guitar pickup to create short loops on my looper pedal. And yes, what I ended up doing was using this very tape here, utilising the album's first track Known for Ages, albeit slowed down to a third of the speed. And what ended up happening was we had this very faint crackling sound on it, as well as that kind of whoop sound that opens up this very album here. And it created a very unusually ghostly effect that apparently helped push the track into the direction band leader Chad Murray was looking for. I will say I have mentioned this to Ross Scott Bukelek, and asked what do you do in these situations actually. And he was very kind about it. He actually turned down a fee for the inclusion of the track in the song, and instead just asked to be credited on the album, which when we get around to releasing will happen, of course. It's a bit of a weird sort of tangential story, but I just think it's really cool because this is one of my favourite albums, and I delight in the fact that it's now a little bit part of the Burden Limbs history now as a result of this weird experimentation that I did. Not even good experimentation though, like my techniques are so rudimentary and primitive, but regardless, I think it's very cool, and I do want to express my gratitude and thanks to Ross, so a huge thank you for that. I think it's very neat. But yes, I think with that we will be coming to the end of our episode of Weird Music. Very glad to have covered a solo album for Diurnal Burdens. The collaborations are truly fascinating to me, especially Esperluette, which we covered in a previous video. But I just adored the vibes that Ross presents, and here it results in such a wonderfully strange, empty, hollow, enigmatic experience. And I'm also, I have to say, very glad to have introduced Eustress tapes to the channel. I actually have to say, I remember this label popping up on my feed when I was in America at the time. This particular album and another one just suddenly popped up on my radar, and I was like, ooh, this seems very cool. I better grab some copies of this now and listen to them when I get home. I'm very glad I did, as it was a wonderful way for myself to get introduced to another strange cassette label. Maybe we will cover another one of their albums in future. I do have a bunch of them now. Who knows? For now though, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.